Gaslighting. Gaslighting is a form of psychological abuse that involves manipulating someone into questioning their own sanity, memories, or perception of reality. It sounds horrible, right? So, an example, a person or institution might say that an activist who's campaigning for change is irrational or, air quote, crazy. Or maybe they'll deny biases if someone confronts them about microaggressions that they're doing. Nobody wants to be gaslit. It can make you feel confused, anxious, and isolated. And we know from research that feeling like that can have a real impact on both your mental and physical health.
But here we are being gaslit by the leaders of our very own United States government. And when we say things like this, I keep coming back to George Orwell's quote from 1984, or I guess you could rewrite it and call it 2025, which says, the party told you to reject the evidence of your eyes and ears. It was their final, most essential command. And this is exactly what's happening now. So, how do we keep ourselves from being fooled? How do we make sure that our collective mental and physical health as a nation doesn't go down the toilet? We need to gather evidence to counteract the denial, the trivializing, the stereotyping that's happening. So, in this episode, that's what we're going to do. We're going to gather evidence to make sure you have all the information you need to stand up and push back against people who say what's happening is normal. Educate yourselves and then each other, because mainstream media is really specifically covering the chaos. We, and by this I mean the collective we, have to cover the truth.
To be clear, nothing that is happening now is normal, and we cannot be gaslit into thinking that it is. Welcome to the Dear White Women podcast, the show that helps white women use their privilege to uproot systemic racism without centering themselves in the process. We are your co-hosts, Sarah and me, Sasha. Okay, let's just dive right into it, because our current president has called the government workforce bloated. And I want to point out that the federal government has not substantially changed in size since the late 1960s, when employment in the government hovered around 2 million people. For what it's worth, in January of 2025, the Bureau of Labor and Statistics, which calculates the total federal workforce every month, said that it hit 2.4 million people. Now, just to contrast those figures, the population of the U.S. in the 1960s was 179 million people, while today, as of 2025, the population is approximately 346 million people, meaning the population has nearly doubled since 1960. And yet, the federal workforce has moved from 2 million to 2.4 million. So how, pray tell, is the government bloated relative to its population right now? In our view, the answer is that while maybe, okay, fine, systems might be antiquated, maybe we need to reallocate things in a well thought out fashion, the simple number of people in the workforce probably is not bloated.
That's a great point, because let's not forget, just because Trump thinks the government, and by this I really think like the government bureaucracy, right, is bloated, he or Doge, and let's asterisk this because we'll get back to them later, do not have a mandate to illegally fire a whole bunch of government employees just because they think this, because that is the job of Congress. So when we talk about these firings, we need to call them what they are: illegal firings.
Thank you for clarifying that, because that's a lot of people who have been fired. And speaking of a lot of people, speaking of numbers, I'm just kind of going to do a crude segue here into the price of things. How is the price of things going for you? Because with the tariffs that Trump announced against Mexico and Canada set to take effect or having taken effect, we need to be prepared for prices of oil to skyrocket. What you might not know is that Canada actually supplies 60% of America's oil. And sure, it's great not to rely too much on Middle Eastern oil because of our friendly neighbors to the north, and they can provide so much. But part of the tariffs are a 10% levy on Canadian energy imports. So keep an eye on the retaliatory trade war, which is likely to begin if it hasn't already.
And when we think about things like oil and energy, I think it's really important to break it down as to look, what does this mean for you? Because a lot of people may think of this as like something abstract or far off. But Time reports that along with what you just talked about, Sarah, refineries can't pivot quickly to other oil sources, meaning that the higher costs that we just talked about get passed to electric bills too. So, like if you like staying cozy, or, we're going to be at some point heading into spring and then summer, like, do you like staying cool? That's going to cost you more each month as well.
Totally. And on the gaslighting, because this is all about being gaslit, Trump's team has characterized these tariffs as a key negotiating tool. The US president, right, is saying he wants to clamp down on the powerful drugs that are being illegally smuggled across the border, fentanyl. And he's variously blamed other countries for the drugs arrival in the US. But a statement from the Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau said that there was no justification for the new US tariffs based on this because less than 1% of the fentanyl intercepted at the US border came from Canada.
I think that's a really important point. And, to answer the question of all those people who Googled what are tariffs after Trump got elected, I think it's really important to just boil it down to simply like tariffs should be thought of as kind of a tax, right? So, what is the bottom line for you? The Peterson Institute for International Economics sort of pegs this economic hit from income hit from the tariffs at about $1,700 annually, right? For a middle income household directly related to these tariffs. So what does that mean? That means probably less dinners out, less date nights, less ice cream after Little League, less movie tickets, less random purchases at Sephora. I can go
I feel
on.
like that's a very personal list to you here.
Well, I mean, some of those, yes. I tried to encompass more of the average American lifestyle. Okay. But anyway, that's one thing. But like, hey, let's say you're thinking about remodeling your house, right? Because it costs too much to buy another house, let's say. And when, we're thinking about remodeling, like that is going to be quite expensive because lumber from Canada comprises more than 70% of our softwood imports, which is according to the National Association of Home Builders. And those imports now face a 25% tariff on top of an already existing 14.5% tax. So think of it as more taxes on those taxes, right? So like you're also looking at $3 to $4 billion increase in costs industry wide. So as if affording a home in America wasn't hard enough, like that is going to make it even harder. Also, do you like appliances? Do you like new appliances, let's say? Or do you need new appliances? Steel and aluminum are set to be tariffed at 25% as of March 12th, according to the BBC. So this means that your next fridge or dishwasher is going to cost more. And Forbes notes that when this happened in 2018, during the first Trump presidency, this jacked up your appliance prices by $86 to $92 per unit. That's almost $100, right? So, maintenance is one cost, right? But if you're replacing them, that's a huge hit to savings, right? Not to harp on tariffs as the sole way that we're being sort of gaslit here, but it's not, to be clear, some giant economic flex rooted in national pride. Tariffs are taxes that will hurt all of us when they're done in this way.
Absolutely. And I'm glad you're not just harping on tariffs because we have way more to talk about beyond tariffs in terms of being gaslit. For example, how are the price of eggs in your neighborhood, Misasha?
Well, I would tell you, but our local grocery store doesn't really have eggs on the shelves right now.
Right? I wound up doing a surprise last minute trip to Costco and was very pleasantly surprised to see one little section left where they had a, purchase limited to 2 boxes per checkout. We're seeing a lot of news media talking about the bird flu and how the USDA is going to invest another 1 billion on top of the roughly 2 billion it's already spent since the bird flu outbreak began in 2022. Just since the start of 2025, more than 30 million egg-laying birds have been killed. Chickens have been killed. And it takes infected farms months to dispose of the carcasses, sanitize their farms, and start raising new birds. So economics 101, supply goes down, prices go up. Sure. But what's not being as widely discussed is that the Agriculture Department is scrambling to rehire several workers who confirm cases of bird flu and other animal diseases who were fired in Doge's governmental purge. So that's going to slow down our ability to respond even more. On top of that, Trump filed several executive orders that froze totally lawful contracts and grants at the USDA, meaning these same farmers and organizations are facing layoffs, work stoppages, and rising debt because the federal government is failing to honor its legally binding financial commitments. And keep in mind, at least according to the stats I could find from 2021, more than 34% of U.S. farms households received government payments. So these are our farmers in our country who provide our food, and they are being squeezed. Who do you think is going to have to make up the difference? The USDA is now predicting that the cost of eggs is going to go up over 41% this year. That's compared to just last month when they thought it was only going to be 20%. It doesn't have to be this way. It certainly doesn't have to be this bad.
Okay, so now that we're super pumped about eggs, bird flu, and the disaster that's facing our farms, let's talk about safety because there's a great Substack from Dear Civil Servant on the huge blast radiuses of the purges that we've been seeing at the federal level. I mean, Sarah, you talked about Doge and, some of the purges related to bird flu, but let's talk about those purges when it comes to our air safety. Weeks after the fatal plane crash in DC, the administration had begun firing several hundred FAA employees, including, quote, personnel hired for FAA radar, landing, and navigational aid maintenance.
And if you'll let me jump in for a moment to interrupt you, I want to point out that as the wife of a pilot, I have been well aware for years that the FAA is understaffed relative to its role. So, I mean, there's firing people and there's just also what we're seeing, which is taking a chainsaw to down an entire forest because, I don't know, a tree might have been infected. Like, this is absolute overkill, and we are damaging our safety infrastructure in a critical organization that keeps our airspace safe at a place that was already understaffed to begin with.
And I want to note when you look and you think about gaslighting here, it's also important to follow the money because what does Elon Musk hold that he would like to have implemented as well? And I think that we can't ignore his interest in SpaceX, in Starlink. Like, are we really finding government inefficiency or are we looking for ways to make Elon rich? And I think that we cannot be gaslit away from this very fundamental economic concept that the world's richest man is trying to make himself richer at the cost of our, well-being, including safety here. And that's not the only example of where we've prioritized other interests over, I don't know, American safety. After the Department of Energy accidentally fired nuclear safety workers and then tried to recall them, some workers who were fired have not returned. And I also heard that because they had been fired, they were not able to contact them because they didn't have their email addresses. No one had ability to really even find their contact information, which seems so wildly short-sighted. But anyway, I digress. Trump's hiring freeze has halted onboarding of federal firefighters ahead of wildfire season, and the layoffs of national parks and forest workers means less personnel for fire safety education efforts, search and rescue missions, and wilderness patrol. And we've already seen, since this has taken effect, natural disasters or claims for federal emergency money coming out of states because they need the support, and it's not there.
Yeah. I mean, I think we are kind of feeling a little doomsday. And I want to just interrupt by saying a lot of people are starting to say, well, we didn't vote for this. Well, sure. When we say, as we have on this show for years, it's all of us or it's none of us, this is what we mean. To be clear, you and I, your two hosts here, actually literally did not vote for this. And yet it is impacting us too. And in fact, what is happening is going to impact a huge majority of our population. Another example, is coming up in the spending bill that may, in fact, lead to a partial governmental shutdown in March of 2025. Up for consideration is Trump's Project 2025 plan of extending tax breaks that were in a 2017 tax bill during the first Trump administration. This is the tax bill where gains for the wealthiest 0.01% were more than 800 times larger than any gains received by the bottom 75 million families in our country. So I think what we are seeing the media covering is that the more people look at what they need to do to fund this billionaire tax cut, things like cutting SNAP and TANF, the programs that basically help the lowest income folks get food and resources and jobs, Medicaid, which most elderly folks in our country rely on for healthcare access. Again, the more we hear about it, the more people don't like it. So it might be tricky to get through. But what's happening? More gaslighting. Trump complained on Thursday on Truth Social, blaming Biden, saying, quote, "He left us a total mess. The budget from last year is still not done. We are working very hard with the House and Senate to pass a clean, temporary government funding bill to the end of September. Let's get it done." But keep in mind, it was congressional Republicans who opted in December to hold over budget negotiations for a few months largely because Trump would be in the White House. Johnson on Fox News in December urged a short-term extension so we, quote, we get to March where we can put our fingerprints on the spending. That's when the big changes start.
I think that's really important. I also think it's really important that what Trump said on Thursday on Truth Social about a CR or continuing resolution, like that is a BS way to get out of passing an actual budget. And so we're going to talk about action, ways that you can take action later in this episode. But one of the things you should do is call your senators and tell them that they have to push, especially your Democratic senators, right, for an actual budget, because a CR is not going, it's just going to allow them to kick the can further. And if he's all about economics, he should be forced to pass a budget or not and see what happens. Okay, so on the topic of gaslighting, let's talk about 2 points of gaslighting here that have been going on for years, because I think we've been talking about right now, sort of what has been immediately, how we've been immediately gaslit. And I mean, we could be here for 5 hours talking about all the ways in which we've been immediately gaslit from sort of the election or actually the inauguration, right? From January 20th on, we have been gaslit in so many ways that it is really hard to condense them down into an episode that anyone's going to want to listen to. But I think we know that this has been a pattern with Trump for many, many years. So I want to talk about two of the ways in which we've been gaslit by him for years. And one has been for at least a decade, right? Because we really need to be clear about these and how we talk about this. First, it was always about Project 2025. Right? Despite Trump and his whole team coming out during the 2024 campaign to deny any involvement with Project 2025, literally every move he's made since January 20th is straight out of the Project 2025 playbook. And I honestly can't tell what's more insulting, that he thought like that this was a believable lie or that he thought we'd forget about Project 2025. I don't know. It's really a toss-up at this point. But regardless, receipts matter here. And there is a great website out there called Project 2025 Tracker, which we'll put in the show notes, which tracks in real time how many of the 297 Project 2025 objectives have already been put in place, and 297, and that is a lot. As of March 5th, the day we're recording this, 87 have been completed and 42 are in progress. That's 129 out of the total 297, and we've had roughly 45 days of this president to date. But the point is this: we saw this happen. We knew it was coming. And yet, as Sarah pointed out, many of us didn't believe it, right? For those of us who did, we said it was coming. There is a large portion of Americans prior to, maybe even now, who don't believe it. But now we have to get loud and get specific, as the repercussions of Project 2025 are already hurting all of us. I also want to talk about Russia. Yes, Russia, Russia, Russia. What culminated in a dressing down of a world leader in the Oval Office, no less, by two individuals who have never remotely faced a conflict scenario like Zelensky has. Not to mention that Zelensky has been our ally for years. This whole Russia influence slash Putin adoration phase of Trump's started likely decades ago. But we've been gaslit about this for the past decade, at least. And like, as some of the memes that have been circulating, Hillary was right. And it was never about Hunter Biden's emails. What Trump has done with the help of J.D. Vance, Elon Musk, and others, including, some stellar individuals like Pete Hegseth and Tulsi Gabbard, and most likely Kash Patel, is to align the United States with Russia, which has changed the past 80 years of world order. So you may be asking, well, what does this mean besides the fact that we are becoming a puppet government for Putin? Well, for one, security around the world changes. We just talked about safety at home, but let's talk about security on an international level. All of those countries who had started nuclear programs, for example, did you know that even Sweden had started a nuclear program back before NATO, and the United States stepping forward as the power balance to Russia, now are realizing that they may also need nuclear weapons due to this US realignment. And to dispel popular myth, maybe, more nuclear weapons does not mean more world security. As anyone who's taken, or maybe even heard of political science can tell you, it means the risk of someone getting angry and taking the nuclear option, literally, right, just exponentially increased. Also, it means that Putin starts getting bolder in Europe, right? Because it's Ukraine now, maybe it's Belarus next. It could be the rest of Europe later. And our government is not only going to be totally fine with it, but we're enabling it. And I also wanted to talk about things that, we don't talk about at all. Like, for example, what do you think this does to intelligence sharing, right? We have historically shared intelligence with our closest allies, which has given us key information for past conflicts, like when Russia invaded Ukraine 3 years ago, not the other way around, to be clear. That information channel, according to government insiders, has likely been irreparably compromised. If we're aligned with Russia, there is no way, for example, that the UK is going to give us key intelligence like they did before January 20th. Our own security suffers as a result, as do those of our troops stationed abroad. This isn't exactly making America great again. It's more like making America weak on a world stage.
It's heartbreaking because I think, as any parent who's raised children knows, you tell the kids it takes a long time to build up trust, and it only takes one thing to lose it and lose it forever. And it takes a very long time, if ever again, to rebuild trust. So you must have integrity. You must tell the truth. Like, that is what most parents teach their children. We're seeing this play out on a world scale, burning down relationships that won't be just, instantly fixed if he says something different and says, oops, I was just kidding. This is like his integrity and the reputation of our country is now been damaged for a very long time.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point because I think people are like, okay, well, the next election cycle, because we've had sort of way more normal election cycles to date, right? Minus, January 6th and an attempted coup. The next election cycle will fix this. It won't, I think, if we get to a next election cycle, right? To be honest, because we are in dismantling 80 years of world order in, a ridiculously short amount of time. We are also breaking things down that may not be able to come back. And so I think that's a really important point about trust and how we're seen in the world, because this is not America on the offensive, right? This is America going to be taking a very defensive stance in the end. It's hard to see now because people get caught up in the propaganda. But this whole episode is about looking past the propaganda, right? So let's talk just briefly about a couple more ways in which we've got to look past that. And Sarah, you had mentioned Medicaid earlier, right? Which is something that so many people in this country rely on, about 72 million Americans to be exact. The program funds 40% of all births and 60% of long-term care at home and in nursing facilities. So really about our elder care as well. When we talk about what the Republican proposals are going to do to Medicaid, it's really important to say things like these proposals will strip health insurance from millions of people. And the result of that is some people will die, some will be permanently and irreparably damaged, and many will be placed in desperate economic circumstances. Medicaid cuts will also cause rural hospitals across America, which rely heavily on Medicaid income, to shut their doors. According to the Century Foundation, the current Trump budget cuts propose up to $880 billion in Medicaid cuts, which is, to be clear, all federal Medicaid payments in 22 states, all of them.
And when you combine these sorts of devastating numbers and truths with things like the National Institute for Health research cuts, this means your kids are more likely to get the flu, especially when we're canceling key meetings to prepare for the flu vaccine for next season. We're also less able to fund key research for diseases that affect millions of people. For example, a projected 15 million Americans will have Alzheimer's in 2050, and that will no longer, we'll both be missing out on research and also missing out on care facilities to care for all of these people. We're going to be less able to treat cancer. Universities and schools that relied on NIH funding are not going to have the budget to do things like, I don't know, accept your kids as students. And of course, we have RFK Jr. heading HHS, who, depending on the day, is either for or against vaccines. He's already said he's going to put common antidepressants, antipsychotics, obesity medications in children under scrutiny after falsely linking, for example, the use of antidepressants to school shootings. And along with that, the agencies seem to be firing people without really much consideration for what's going to happen after they do that. For example, the chief of the Autism, ADHD, and Externalizing Disorders Interventions Research Program at the National Institute of Mental Health. So how is this going to play out, for work that in this organization, for example, was focused on getting low-cost, evidence-based mental health care into schools and communities? And while I'm talking about kids for a second here, I want to talk about tremendous cuts at the Department of Education, including, for example, canceling contracts with like this one branch that gathers and disseminates data on a whole range of topics, including research-based teaching practices and the state of US student achievement, which is the data that fuels our nation's report card. We're going to be operating with no information going forward on how students are doing in this country. And keep in mind that the Department of Ed is the department that's responsible for protecting legally those students with individualized education plans, kids who need special education. They're coming for anybody who's different.
I think that's important. And it's also important to note that the government has now created a way to report teaching that isn't in line with the official administration anti-DEI policy. For example, Trump took credit for, quote, removing CRT from our schools, which, as Sarah, you know, this is a specific point of mine, that CRT is never taught in the way that he describes it in our K through 12 schools. But he's taking credit for something that is a lie. So we are being gaslit again.
Let's keep up with the gaslit. Yeah.
But it's also really important to note that when he says things like that, what is the economic cost of the administration in its anti-DEI stance? Because according to a recent report from Red Wine and Blue, public schools spent $3.2 billion fighting divisive culture wars being waged on our schools. And that was just last year. Politicians and extremist groups have been pushing efforts to ban books, restrict schools from teaching about race and racism, and set restrictive policies for LGBTQIA plus students. And school districts fighting high levels of these efforts spend an average of $812,000 apiece last year. This is not what most parents want for our schools, nor is it saving us money, a la Doge, right? In fact, it's directly costing us billions. And in case you missed it, Linda McMahon was quietly confirmed as the Secretary of Education, someone with zero experience, along with a mandate to shut the department down. So these are talking points that we have to be talking about.
So, what do we do? Like you just said, we have to be talking about it. We have to get loud. We have to talk to everyone that you know about this. Because for anybody who used to say, oh, I don't do politics, this isn't about politics. This is about our lives and how every single one of us exists in our community. So please call your representatives. Fivecalls.org makes it super easy. Misasha, you actually heard that the tipping point for senators, according to Sharon McMahon, is 400 calls from constituents means this is a big, big deal. So call about the things that matter to you every single day if you can and if it's needed.
I agree. And also, if you feel like you would rather die than call your representatives, call and leave a voicemail because those count too. So even if you can't make those calls during the regular business hours of the Senate or the House, call and leave voicemails. And one final note to sort of end this all or tie this all together. Chaos from Trump, from our second president, Musk, from the entire sort of Project 2025 planners, that's the plan. We can't let ourselves get distracted, although I know it's really hard to do, with these outrageous, literal daily statements from Trump saying things like he's taking away our First Amendment rights to protest on campus or our 14th Amendment rights for birthright citizenship. Because to this date, he can't do that by himself. He cannot remove constitutional rights yet, hopefully ever. But what the effect of that is it gets everyone talking about those things and those things only because they're so sensational. Meanwhile, he is gaslighting us about everything else out there. If you listen to his State of the Union or whatever it's called before you have a year in office, he told on himself when he said Elon Musk was the head of Doge, something that his attorneys have fought and actually lied in court documents about as a result. Pay attention to the things that we can and should be fighting for now, where we have an impact. We can absolutely, for example, fight against an unelected billionaire sociopath who's undermining our country's basic abilities to function. Because in the end, as you said, Sarah, it's about community, and we are in this for all of us.
You've just listened to the Dear White Women podcast with your hosts, Sarah and me, Sasha. Yes, we're on social media, and yes, you can hire us to do talks about our book, but the biggest thing, don't forget to sign up for our newsletter to receive our free materials. Head over to dearwhitewomen.com to get on the list.